There are moments in history that never made it into any textbook, not because they were unimportant, but because someone decided they were too dangerous to remember. And sometimes, the only way the truth survives is through a single voice. An old woman near the end of her life, sitting in a dim room with a tape recorder running, telling a story she had carried in silence for more than 50 years. She said she had promised him she would never speak of it. She said she had kept that promise until the man she made it to was long dead, until the tower they built together had been torn down and sold for scrap, until nearly everyone who could have contradicted her was gone. And then, with her hands trembling and her voice thin, she pressed record and said the words she had been holding since one night in the spring of 1903. She said, music. The lights came on miles away with no wires. The lights came on. And that was the moment the world decided he had to be stopped. To understand why that sentence matters, you have to understand who this woman worked for. Because whatever you think you know about the modern world, the glow of the screen you are watching this on, the hum of the current running through your walls, the vast invisible web of power that carries civilization from one hour to the next, nearly all of it traces back to a single mind, Nikola Tesla. A man who thought in electricity the way other men think in words. Without his alternating current system, the electrical grid as we know it would not exist. The engineers of his own era admitted as much. One of them, decades later, said that without Tesla's work, it would be a much darker and much quieter world. And that is not poetry. That is engineering. The reason a city can light up at the flip of a switch, the reason power can travel hundreds of miles from a distant station to your bedside lamp, is because one obsessive genius solved a problem everyone else had given up on. But this story is not about the work that made him famous. This story is about the work that made him disappear. Because there was a project, the one closest to his heart, the one he believed would change human civilization forever, that the history books describe in a single, tidy, and according to his assistant, completely misleading sentence. They call it Wardenclyffe. They call it a wireless communication project. A tower on Long Island meant to send messages across the ocean without wires. An early attempt at what would later become radio. That is the official version. That is the version approved for public consumption. And the woman on that tape said it was a lie of omission so large that it hid the greatest scientific gamble of the 20th century in plain sight. She was there. She was one of the small handful of people who knew what the tower was actually built to do. She was, by her own account, a young engineer, a woman working in a man's field in an era when that was nearly unheard of. And she had earned her place at Tesla's side through sheer competence. Music, running calculations, wiring coils, and keeping notes that she was later told to burn. Her name, she said, had been carefully scrubbed from every record connected to the project. She was not in the photographs. She was not in the payroll ledgers that survived. If you went looking for her today, you would find nothing but a gap where a person used to be. And she believed that erasure was deliberate. She believed she had been made to vanish for the same reason the tower's true purpose had been buried. Because she had seen something happen that powerful men could not allow the world to know was possible. What she said Tesla was truly building was not a way to send messages. It was a way to send power. Limitless electricity transmitted through the air and through the ground itself to any point on the surface of the earth. No wires, no cables strung from pole to pole across continents, no meters ticking away in basements. A farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, a village with no road to it, a ship in the middle of the ocean, all of them able to draw energy from the atmosphere the way you draw a breath, free, universal. His dream, she said, was to give the whole planet light and to give it to the poor and the forgotten first, the people who would never otherwise afford it. He wanted electricity to be like sunshine, something that simply existed for everyone at no cost. And that dream, she said, is exactly what got him destroyed. The money behind Wardenclyffe came from one of the most powerful financiers who ever lived, J.P. Morgan, a man who controlled banks and railroads and steel, a man whose signature could move the American economy. Tesla had gone to Morgan and secured his backing by describing the tower as a wireless telegraph system, a way to leap ahead of every competitor in the race to send messages across the Atlantic without cables. Morgan understood messages. Messages could be sold. Messages could be metered and billed and monopolized the way Morgan had monopolized everything else he touched. So, Morgan wrote the checks and construction began at Shoreham on the flat sandy stretch of Long Island where the tower would rise. But the true plan, the transmission of raw power to the entire planet, Tesla shared only with the tight circle of assistants he trusted completely. The assistant on that tape was one of them, and she said that from the very beginning there was a quiet understanding among that inner group that what they were building could not be described honestly to the man paying for it. Because the moment Morgan understood what the tower was really for, everything would change. And when that moment finally came, she said, it came fast, and it came hard, and it came in the dead of, but before I take you to that night, you have to understand what the tower actually was. Because the newspapers of the day made it sound like the folly of a genius who had lost his grip. They saw a strange wooden framework climbing out of the Long Island scrub, nearly 187 feet of crisscross timber beams braced waist and bolted like the skeleton of some enormous, unfinished creature. At the very top sat a great mushroom-shaped dome sheathed in metal, catching the sun so that on clear days you could see it glinting from miles off. To the farmers and the fishermen and the reporters who came out to gawk, it looked like nonsense. It looked like a rich man's toy that had gotten out of hand. They had no idea that the most important part of the structure was not the part they could see, because beneath the tower, driven down into the sandy earth, was a second structure entirely. The assistant described it in careful detail on the tape, her voice slow and deliberate, as if she wanted to be sure the recording caught every word. Below the wooden legs of the tower, there was a shaft, and off that shaft a maze of tunnels and chambers reaching down into the ground. Iron pipes had been sunk deep, all the way down to the water table, so that the tower would not merely stand on the earth, but would be joined to it, anchored electrically into the living body of the planet. Tesla, she said, used to describe it as gripping the earth, not touching it, gripping it, as if the whole apparatus were a hand closing around something enormous, ready to make it move. And that was the heart of the idea, the thing that separated Tesla from every other inventor of his age. He did not believe the earth was a passive lump of rock. He believed the planet was, in effect, an enormous electrical conductor, a sphere that could carry a current the way a copper wire carries one, if only you knew how to speak to it in its own language. Every object, he believed, has a natural frequency at which it wants to vibrate. Strike a wine glass and it hums at its note. Push a child on a swing at the right rhythm, and small pushes build into great arcs. Tesla believed the earth itself had such a rhythm, a natural electrical pulse, and that if he could build a machine that vibrated in perfect time with it, he could pour energy into the ground and have the entire planet ring like a struck bell. The current would spread through the earth, and it would rise again, unchanged and undiminished, wherever a receiver was tuned to the same note. The assistant was adamant about this. She said again and again on the tape that these were not the daydreams of a man who had drifted into fantasy. They were built on experiments, real ones she had watched with her own eyes and helped set up with her own hands. Before Wardenclyffe, before Long Island, there had been earlier work in the mountains out west, where Tesla had strung his coils in a high wooden shed and thrown switches that made lightning leap across the room in bolts longer than a man is tall. She spoke of thunderclaps that rolled off the peaks, of a horse in a nearby field that bolted at the sparks, of the smell of scorched air so thick it made your eyes water. He had learned there, she said, that the earth would answer him if he called to it correctly. Wardenclyffe was meant to be the answer made permanent, the proof made global, and she offered one memory as evidence, one that she said she had never repeated to anyone in all the decades she stayed silent. She described a test they ran in the fields around Shoreham months before the Great Night. Tesla had ordinary light bulbs carried out and placed at intervals across the land, some of them a good distance from the tower. She said miles, though the tape crackles at the number and it is hard to be certain. There were no wires running to them, no cables buried in the dirt, no lines strung overhead. The bulbs simply stood in the grass on little stands, glass and filament and nothing else, waiting. And she remembered the man who set them out grumbling that it was a waste of an evening, that no light bulb lights itself. Then the system was brought up. She said she felt it before she saw anything, a low vibration coming up through the soles of her boots, a hum that seemed to come from the ground rather than the machine. Her teeth ached faintly. The little hairs on her arms lifted and stood, and out in the darkening field, one by one, and then all at once, the bulbs began to glow. Not brightly at first, she said, a dim orange thread inside the glass, like an ember waking up, then steadier, then a clean warm light, dozens of them scattered across the black field, burning with no wire to feed them, floating in the dark like a scattering of low stars that someone had set down in the grass. She said the grumbling men went completely silent. One of them took his hat off, she remembered, the way a person does in church without deciding to, because in that year, in that world, electricity meant wires. It meant copper and poles and the visible, traceable path from the generator to the lamp. To see light with no path to it, no thread connecting it to any source, was not merely surprising. It broke something in the mind. It looked, she said, like magic. It looked like the future had reached back and touched them, and every man in that field understood, in a way he could not have put into words, that the rules were about to change for everyone, and that somebody somewhere was going to be very unhappy about it. She said Tesla did not celebrate. She spoke of the great primary coil wound in heavy copper, thick as a wrist, and of the secondary that rose in a spiral toward the dome. She spoke of the shaft that dropped straight down beneath the tower into the earth, 100 feet and more, lined with iron, branching at the bottom into pipes that pushed outward through the soil like the roots of a tree reaching for water. Tesla called the ground connection the most important part of the entire machine. Anyone could throw sparks into the sky, he told her. The genius, he said, was in how you held on to the planet. She had not understood that at first, and she said so plainly on the tape with the honesty of an old woman who no longer cared about looking clever. She had assumed, like most people, that the tall dome was the heart of the thing, that the drama was all up in the air. Tesla corrected her patiently again and again. The earth, he told her, was not empty dirt. It was a vast conductor, a sphere charged and alive, and it had a rhythm of its own own, a natural frequency at which the whole planet, in some sense, rang like a struck bell. If a man could tune his machine to that exact rhythm, if he could push and release his current in perfect time with the Earth's own pulse, then the energy would not scatter and die in the ground. It would spread. It would ride the planet's own resonance the way a small push on a swing, timed just right, sends a child soaring far higher than the strength of the push alone could ever explain. She said he used that image often, the child on the swing. Timing, he told her, not force. A weak man who understood the rhythm could move more than a strong man who fought against it. And she came to believe that this was the true secret of Wardenclyffe, the thing that separated it from every other electrical experiment of the age. Others were building bigger generators, longer wires, stronger dynamos, throwing more and more power at the problem. Tesla was doing something stranger and quieter. He was listening to the Earth, learning its note, and preparing to sing it back. She remembered the night he first showed her the measurements he had taken of that natural rhythm. He spread his papers on a workbench under a single lamp, and the numbers ran down the page in his cramped, urgent hand. He tapped one figure with his finger and told her that this was the frequency of the planet, the pulse beneath everything, and that when the tower matched it, the whole surface of the world would become his wire. Any receiver, anywhere, tuned to that same note would draw power out of the ground as easily as dipping a cup into a river. No poles, no copper strung across continents, no meter counting pennies at the wall. A farmhouse in a valley with no road to it could have light. A ship in the middle of the ocean could have power. A village on the far side of the earth could have exactly what a city had, and none of it would cost the person using it a single coin. She said that when he described it, his eyes were wet, and she realized this was not for him a matter of engineering. It was a matter of justice. He had grown up watching people labor in the dark, she said, watching how comfort and safety and knowledge then flowed only to those who could pay for the wire. And he wanted to cut that cord for good. He wanted to hand the planet's own energy back to everyone who lived on it. And that, she said on the tape, her voice dropping almost to a whisper, was exactly the thing that could not be allowed. Because a gift like that, she said, is only a gift to the people who receive it. To the people who had spent fortunes stringing the wires, sinking the poles, building the plants that burned coal through the night, it was not a gift at all. It was the end of everything they had built. And she wanted whoever was listening to understand that this was not a story about a machine failing. It was a story about a machine working too well. She talked for a long stretch about the money and about the man who held it. The financier had signed his checks believing he was buying a way to send messages across the ocean without a cable, a wireless telegraph that could carry stock quotes and private words faster than any ship. That was a business he understood. Information was something you could sell, meter, and control. You could charge a man for every word he sent. But power was different. Power flowing freely through the ground to any cup dipped into the river could not be counted, could not be fenced, could not be owned. And she said the financier was not a foolish man. He was, if anything, too clever. The moment he grasped what the tower was truly meant to do, he did not marvel. He went cold. She remembered the day a letter came from the financier's office, and how Tesla read it standing by the window, and how his jaw tightened. The letter, she said, was polite. It always was. It spoke of budgets and of staying within the agreed scope of the work. It suggested gently that the inventor confine his efforts to the communication system that had been funded and set aside these other ambitions for a later day. She understood, watching him fold the paper, that a leash had just been laid across his shoulders and that he had already decided not to wear it. He did not slow music down. If anything, she said, the letter made him burn hotter. He worked longer hours, slept less, ate almost nothing. She would find him at 3 o'clock in the morning walking the floor beneath the tower, checking the connections to the pipes that ran down into the earth, muttering figures to himself. She began to worry for his health, and more than that, she began to worry for the whole enterprise because she could feel the ground shifting under them. The money was thinning. Suppliers were being paid late. Workers drifted away when their wages came slow, and the great wooden skeleton of the tower stood half-finished against the sky waiting for a completion that grew less certain with every passing week. And still he believed. That was the thing she could never fully explain, even decades later on that crackling tape. He believed the way other men breathed. He would stand in the field at dusk looking up at the dome catching the last of the light, and he would tell her that once the world saw it work, once a single lamp lit in a distant house with no wire feeding it, the argument would be over. No financier could stand against a demonstration. The truth of the thing would carry itself. People would demand it. The old order of poles and meters would simply fall away the way candles fell away when the electric bulb arrived, and no amount of money could hold that tide back once it turned. She said she wanted so badly to believe him, and on the small scale she already did because she had seen the small proofs with her own eyes. She described one afternoon when he had set up a demonstration for her alone. No visitors, no press. He had placed placed a series of bulbs on a wooden frame out in the field, a good distance from the tower, connected to nothing at all. No wire ran to them. She checked, she said. She walked the whole length of it and ran her hands through the grass looking for a hidden cable because she did not yet fully trust what he claimed, and she found nothing. The bulbs sat in the open air, cold and dark and unattached to any source of power in the world. Then he went to his controls and she stood by the frame and she waited. She heard the machinery come up somewhere behind her, a low building hum that she felt in her teeth more than heard with her ears. The hair on her arms lifted. There was a smell in the air she had come to know well by then, sharp and clean, like the air after a storm. And then, one by one, the bulbs began to glow. Faintly at first, a dull orange in the filaments, and then brighter until they burned a steady warm yellow, standing there in the middle of an empty field lit by nothing she could see or touch. She said she reached out and put her hand near one of them and felt its warmth on her palm. And she started to laugh, and then, without meaning to, she started to cry because she understood in that instant that everything he had told her was true. Not a theory, not a dream, a fact glowing in the grass in front of her. The earth itself was carrying his current, and here at the end of it, miles of empty air away from the tower, that current was becoming light in her hand. She said she never forgot the feeling of that warmth, and that in her last years, lying awake at night, she could still summon it, the heat of an impossible lamp on her skin. She did not know that afternoon that others had been watching, too. She would only understand that much later, after the night everything changed. But looking back, she said, she thought the demonstrations had grown too bold, the lights too visible, the rumors too loud. Something out beyond the tree line had begun to take notice, and whatever it was, it did not announce itself. It simply watched and waited and made its plans in the dark. For years after Wardenclyffe fell silent, she kept all of this folded away inside her like a letter she could not bring herself to burn. She married, she told no one, she raised a family in a small house far from Long Island, and when people asked what she had done as a young woman, she said only that she had worked as an engineer's assistant, which was true, and left the rest alone. But she said the weight of it never lifted. Every time a storm rolled in and the sky went that particular shade of violet, she thought of the ark leaping off the dome. Every time a light flickered for no reason, she caught her breath. And so, in the last winter of her life in 1957, with her hands shaking and her voice thin, she sat down alone with a borrowed reel-to-reel recorder and told the whole thing from the beginning. She said she was not doing it for fame because she asked that her name stay off it. She was doing it, she said, because she could not carry it into the ground with her, and because she believed the world had a right to know what a man had almost given it and what had been taken away in the night before it could be given. That tape sat in a box for decades. It surfaced, of all places, at an estate sale, a battered spool of magnetic ribbon that a collector bought for almost nothing along with a lot of old radio parts. When it was finally cleaned and played, half of it was gone, hissing static and dropouts, whole minutes lost to age. But enough survived, enough to hear an old woman describe the smell of ozone, the warmth of a wireless lamp on her palm, and the silhouettes of uniformed men standing motionless beyond the trees. And here is the part that keeps people awake. In the early 2000s, a historian went looking to see whether any of it could be checked against the cold, indifferent record of machines that do not lie and do not remember. He pulled telegraph logs from that spring in 1903 and readings from a magnetic observatory that had been quietly recording the Earth's as electrical mood night after night, year after year. And on the very night she described, in the hours after midnight, the instruments recorded something they had no explanation for. A pulse, a steady disturbance in the ground, and the air that lasted roughly 40 minutes and then simply stopped, centered almost precisely on a patch of Long Island called Shoreham. In the ledgers, it was written down in the careful, bloodless language of science as an anomalous terrestrial resonance event. No cause given, no cause ever found. 40 minutes, the length of a single experiment run at full power one time by a man who had been told to stay within his limits and had decided, just once, to find out what the whole planet could do. Everything else, the old woman said, had a way of standing up, too, if you cared to look. The tower really did rot and fall and get sold for scrap. Tesla really did die alone in a hotel room in the winter of 1943. And within hours, government men really did arrive and carry away his papers under guard. Though he had been a citizen for half a century and by every rule should have been left in peace. When those papers were catalogued, sections really were found to be missing. And against the empty entries, someone really did write that single strange word, relocated, and never once explained where or to whom or why. Decades later, when some of it was pried loose by law, the word surfaced again, still undefined. The notebooks it referred to still nowhere to be found, and people still go out to that field. Researchers, hobbyists, the curious, standing on the ground where the tower once gripped the earth. And now and then their instruments twitch, a faint, irregular flutter near the frequency he was said to have chosen, rising and falling for no reason anyone can name. Most call it background noise, the ordinary hum of a modern world full of wires, but a few of them stand very still when it happens. And they think about an old woman's warm palm and a lamp that burned in an empty field. And they wonder whether something down there is still ringing very softly 120 years after a man threw a switch and then, in fear, threw it back. She said the last thing Tesla ever told her about it was not a boast. It was almost a confession. They realized it worked, he said, and that is why they stopped it. Not because it failed, because it succeeded. Because a world where light and heat and power belong to everyone, for free, delivered on the wind to the poorest cabin as easily as to the richest mansion, was a world that certain people could not permit to exist. And so they buried it, and they buried the man, and they very nearly buried the memory of both, except for one young engineer who felt an impossible warmth on her hand and refused, at the very end, to let it go. So I want to leave it with you. If a single night in 1903 really did prove that the whole earth could carry free power to anyone who tuned in, and someone made the deliberate choice to bury that instead of build it, then here is my question for you. What do you think we would be living in right now if that switch had never been thrown back? And do you believe that resonance out at Shoreham is only noise, or is it something that never fully stopped? Tell me in the comments. I read every one.